Okay, well, thank you very much for attending our session. This session is on intensive economic growth in pre-modern East Asia 1000 to 1800. And I'd like to briefly introduce our panel. First off, we'll have Dr. Deng speaking on demystifying growth in the development of northern Song China, 960 to 1127. Professor Yoshiniba Shiba will be the discussant for that paper. Second will be William Guangling Liu, and his paper is entitled The Study of Evolution of China's Farming Patterns and Changes in Agricultural Productivity circa 1000 to 1500. And the eminent Professor Yoshiniba Shiba will also discuss that paper. Third will be myself, Ron Edwards, and my paper is entitled Economic Growth in Song China in England, and Professor William Guangling Liu will be the discussant for that paper. Next will be Kajiro Taguchi, and the title of his paper is Economic Development of the Early Modern China, Revisiting, and Professor Mio Kishimoto will be the discussant for that paper. Kenichi Tonobi will be the next presenter, Fertility, Mortality, and Economic Development in Tokugawa, Japan. And that will be Professor Price Fishback will be the discussant for that paper. Last but not least will be Miho Tanaka, and she's going to present a paper on long-term interest rate changes in the credit and loan markets and economic development during Tokugawa, Japan. Tokugawa period. And Naomi Lamoy will be the presenter as the discussant for that paper. So without further ado, for time constraints, let's go ahead and please, Dr. Deng, please come up and present.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Thank you, everybody. And I know this is really a end of the day and also very hot. So I'm going to do it very quickly. The issue is Song China and its intensive growth. When I did my PhD, my supervisor told me, tell me about Song. And I said, I know nothing about Song. And he was completely disappointed. I said, you're Chinese, how come you don't know anything about Song? Now, 25 years later, I know something about Song, so here we are. Now, the difference between Song and pre-Song town is that the Song economy supported a doubled population, and the Song was very commercialized, and the urbanization rate easily doubled the town level. And the Song was the beginning of the Chinese maritime history. The Chinese start to sail across East Asia and Southeast Asian waters. So why and how Song became so specialized, a special case in Chinese history? Why it didn't happen before and why it didn't continue later on? So to find out why, I will be very, very quick. There are two issues here and two major factors. One is environmental. The other one is geopolitical. Now, the environmental story is this. This is the right slide. If you divide the Song territory, which was roughly the Qin Empire, when China was first united by the first emperor, you see China's territory actually shrunk from its town record size. If you divide the Song territory into these zones, then you realize, in fact, the northern part of Song, agricultural production declined. Reports were such that nobody wanted to farm in North China. Why? Simply because we had a little ice age, mainly affecting that part of China. Now, so people start to move south to grow food. Food prices going up simply because the shortage of food. And in the north, those who decide to stay, they become more commercialized and they start to mine iron ore and they start to produce iron steel. Especially in northern part of the territory around Kaifeng, where the capital city was located. So the natural disaster actually persuaded Chinese not to farm, which is really quite extraordinary. Now in the south, they decide, because the Little Ice Age, to support enough, to support people with enough food, they introduce a winter crop, which is the winter wheat along the Yangtze River region. So you have a double cropping in the south. Further south, and also in the west, farming was still very primitive, but because in the north people start to produce metals, in these two regions, copper, lead, and tin, three major metals to produce bronze coins, began to take off. So you see the regional division of labor reshuffled in such a way it becomes something else. The farming economy becoming, in some ways, a mixed economy. Now, meanwhile, the Song faced enormous pressure from the north, perhaps for the same reason, because the Little Ice Age pushed the nomads southwards. And during this period, this is a Great War. The Great War was lost to the nomads. Also, the Silk Road is gone. So the Song Chinese start to pay tribute orderly to their northern neighbors. This was the other, it should be the other way around. These guys should pay tribute to the Chinese, but not anymore. Why? Because they defeat the Chinese repeatedly. The Song army never actually won any war at all against all the nomads. So to actually support the demand from the nomads, the whole economy geared towards selling. Why? Because the nomads didn't ask for women, they didn't ask for slaves, they didn't ask even for food. They want silk, they want silver, they want luxuries from Southeast Asia, such as, on the record, spices, such as turtle shells. So the Song Chinese had to actually go out to find those things, otherwise they will march in to finish the Song regime off. Indeed, they did. At the end of Northern Song, they take over the northern territory of the Song dynasty, and this will be the beginning of the Southern Song. So this is a demarcation politically line between the nomads and the Southern Song. So basically, the Song economy was in a turning point to become more commercialized because of the climate change and also geopolitical threat from the north. So after that, we see a change which can be highlighted as such. I have one chart to show what's going on, and that will be the end of my presentation. I have some, usual kind of a quantitative attempt to show the changes. Let's see where we are. I promise wrong. I'll be very short, very, very quick. Oh God.
This is the LSE speed reading.
Speed reading course, yes, indeed. We pay a lot of money for doing that. Oh God, where are we? I have a quite neat diagram. No, it's probably not in this with this version. Anyway, the result is this: the Chinese farming become regionalized and intensively done. Secondly, the Chinese economy start to become open towards shipping towards Southeast Asia. I just visited this morning the Cultural Museum of Kyoto, and they have a display of collections of Chinese coins and also displays of Chinese porcelain. The green porcelain started from Song Dynasty. Indeed, the Japanese start to import large quantities of green porcelain from the Song, from Song China, and also loads of coins hoarded by the upper classes of this town. And so here we are. Even in this place, we still find history showing the changes in China. Thank you so much.
Next, we have Professor Yoshimi Mishiba to discuss this paper. Please speak shortly if you wish.
Sir, I am Shiba. I'm sorry for my inferior quality of the English. And the paper presented by Professor Deng is indeed a provocative argument on the causes of growth in some economy. It also challenges some of the conventional notions that is still prevailing. Professor can start with 1% population increase, population growth during that time through the late northern Sun as an indication of an unprecedented evidence of the growth in the history of Chinese economy. Then he moves to his search for the causal explanation that brought about such growth and prosperity. First, he rejects the supply side explanation, especially the notion of the agrarian revolution, once raised by the Ho-Ping under the influence of the Kato Shigeshi. And among others, Professor Deng rejects the dissemination of improved rice seeds, champa rice. In the rice culture of the middle and south part of China, the Song, generally, I agree, I contend with his idea. But in my view, the champa rice is just one kind of the early ripening rices. And my some Japanese understanding of the merit of the champa rice is that it enables the farmers to avoid the damage by the heavy rainfall in June and September. So that it means a stabilization of rice culture in an area of the just reclaimed paddies in the central and south China. Yes. So, but there's another Japanese notion that in terms of technology, the sun advancement is not so high. Just inherited the northern and traditional technologies in the north and in the south. The evidence is very rather scarce about the introduction of the oxen and new type of farm tools and fertilizers and so on. So we should ask the causes of the population growth. If we take the population growth as surrogate of the economic development, we should look into the another reasons. That is demand side, and he also put emphasis in his paper. Of course, and I just forgot to say that Professor Kent refers to the some kind of the improvement of agriculture in the north, but I cannot believe in that. For example, by a record of the food chi in the middle of the yuan, there is an estimation that millet cultivation in the north, this is the case of the Shandong, was still largely unstable. And people had to cultivate 100 more of land. But every alternative year, the harvest failure, crop failure, visited that farm. So although the estimated per acre yield was about 0.8 bushel of land, but the people have to calculate an average yield as just half of that, because then every another year the disasters comes. So far as I believe in this testimonies values, and I think in the middle of the Yuan times, the agriculture in the north was not so high and unstable. This is a notion that Professor Lee also referring to. Say, okay.
Take your time.
Okay.
And the leisure you have.
Then move to the Professor Kent's second theme, that Professor done another important suggestions. This is this is very impressive one. That is pressure from northern nomads tribes and some states compromising diplomacy in response to it. by giving ransom to such northern people, a fair amount of the silver and silk cloth and tea. And Professor Deng suggests that these are burdens of the northern government. Let them to push forward the industries and circulation of such items of international trade, like tea and silk and so on. This would be so, but I have some skepticism about the topic. We have some data in the maritime trade in the south that through Guangdong and Zhuangzhou, the evidence survived to tell us that abundant amount of silver was exported from these two ports. But in the hand of the Islamic merchants, they surely came from the Iran and East Islamic Empire. So the traders at the south, and the silver traded at the south, had paid their weight into the Islamic world. And the problem is that in the north, some Japanese argues that fair amounts of the ransom and traded silver came back to the Chinese territory through the exchange at the border. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I want to know the termination, destination of the silver, silk, and other tea and other items of trade. If they get back to China, it's not a big problem. But recent Japanese studies giving stories of the people, Sogdian and Uyghurian people, Uyghurian merchant, who acted as a middleman in the Silk Road, tended to be wielding very influential power in that route of the trade of East-West. So, if the silver silver went to northern nomads by way of the ransom or the border trade, went to the western part of the Silk Road and get into the hands of the Iranic merchant. This is a big problem, Eurasian trade as a whole. So I want to know that where is the silver and the silks finally went to. So as to the state law, I think I generally agree with him, with Professor Deng's notion. But there is a problem of the relationship between the civil service government, civil bureaucracy, and its economic growth. Professor John Hicks once suggested that although the civil service bureaucracy will be strengthened by the power of the commerce and the economy, but the relationship between the states and the economy it's still not certain. This is a problem to be clarified in the future. So, for example, in Warring States period, the China's economy is not so well developed, but very successful civil bureaucracy emerged at the time. But it was the matter of the Tang and Song period that rising commerce and economy surely strengthened the emergence of the restructuring of the civil service bureaucracy, so that how is the state's role in the economy? The document suggested that mostly the revenue economy, not the real economy. So, revenue economy will be managed by the bureaucrats, but behind of that, there is a rise of the general private sector economy. So this is my suggestion. Okay.
Next, we have Professor William Guanglio from Science and Technology University in Hong Kong.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. Thanks, many of my teacher friends, Shiba Sensei. In particular, I want to express my gratitude. Let me explain the current paper. It's actually a byproduct of my PhD thesis. In my PhD thesis, I try to compare in quantitative way the Tang-Song transformation, which centered in the 10th and 11th century, with Ming-Qing transformation that lasted from 16th century down to the the whole 17th century. To my surprise, I mean, everyone complain we do not have enough data. But to my surprise, I mean, we still find some reliable data that particularly concentrated on the 11th century and the later 14th century and the early 15th century, the early Ming period when the Ming dynasty was established. And we are lucky we have the data on the population, money, stock. You can use coin produced by imperial means to reconstruct money stock, and the trade volume based on the commercial tax data, and okay, I will stay here. And it points to the market expansion in the 11th century, as basically that's my conclusion. And what happened? Then you see the market contract in the early Ming period due to the anti-market policy promoted by the founding emperor Zhu Yuanzhang of the Ming dynasty. He hated merchants, he hated the bureaucracy, he hated corruption. So he basically, we learn from many anecdotes and historical documents that he executed them or sent a lot of them, exiled to the frontier, and confiscated their family property and land holding. That's all the this qualitative evidence. But surprisingly, we do find if measured in the macroeconomic level, we find the diminish of the market. What about the 16th century? Unfortunately, because the data became the quality of data declined sharply, it became unreliable. So we have nothing to say about the Ming-Qing transformation in quantitative way. Although personally, I believe the Chinese market, played a very large role in this new economic development. That will be a challenge for the future research. However, I'm challenged first by the feedbacks. The scholars, they doubt my research for a couple of reasons, the two major reasons. One, through my research, you can find, in opposite to our thinking, in Chinese economic history, this historical data, you find the earlier the period, the better the quality. That's a little bit strange. And the second reason is, as you know, this one commentator, the external reviewer commentated in my book, my manuscript, is I only use those market-based data and the military wage data, which present very relatively a small share of the traditional Chinese economy, right? The majority, the main sector is agriculture. The majority of the population were farmers. How this, even you assume I'm right? How can I go further to prove changes in the market would substantially influence the living standard of commoners who in their daily life, if not isolated from, but surely keep a certain distance from the market, right? It's not a modern China, it's a traditional China. So that bases the question. And thanks for his advice, I, revised my manuscript into the two books. So far, I just finished this one book that focuses on the economic performance and the data quality, and the appendices to explain about whether quality is reliable or not. I will skip over this part. It's not a focus on my report today. But basically, I would just give one sentence to explain. It's not only the years, early or later years to decide the quality of data. It's rather all this data was produced by the government. So it's basically and initially and basically is a perception of the government decided the quality of data. If the government knows, how the market performed, then you get the data, like the commercial tax data, will much more accurate, so to speak, to reflect the trend in the market and also the population. If the government allow free migration, for instance, in the 11th and 12th century China, then you will know exactly without tremendous difficulty, the government would know the long-term trend in the aggregate household across the country. But when it came to the early Ming period, the free migration was forbidden, right? It's basically forced people into Li Jia system. It's a hereditary. With the resistance, right? Certainly you can expect resistance. The people, fled away from where they want to live, but they will never report to the government. So government has no correct information. So that's so far about the data part. But what about the agriculture productive part? It's really difficult. And I must admit, I do not have the reliable data at the macro level. What I try to do is related all these other I'm able to identify the variables, incorporate a framework, as I mentioned here, a shift from intensive farming to extensive agriculture, to interpret this long-term decline in agriculture productivity. I will not define the terms, as it's all familiar to you. Basically, I'm trying to say the early Ming Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang established a command economy that made people either lost incentive to produce, before previously in comparison they driven by market, produce for more profit, or because it's forced migration, people were forced to move to the wasteland without support of technology, farming tool, fertilizer, and even without this drafting animal. So this farm size extended at the same time, the household farm size. So inevitably, it caused a huge decline in farm yield per acre. Here is a new question, right? Although this Zhu Yuanzhang, the Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang was brutal to intellectual and the rich people, his blooding, he he basically executed so many officials, generals and high officials. But he claimed it will do good since he's clean the official term. He's do good to the commoner. And even he tried to damage people, right? He was emperor. How could one individual influence millions of millions Chinese people, right? He was not the Chairman Mao. Where is my evidence? Where is the command economy, right? In a traditional period, without all this communist ideology, modern police, all these things, right? Where come my data? I will skip over the Northern Song part. It's, in general, I shared with Dr. Deng report, about this agriculture, this in North China, all these things, along with urbanization. Only one thing I would like to mention is my estimate as Northern Song, achieved this farm yield per mu was even lower than 20% lower than Dr. Deng's. That already would allow the Song farmers to live a higher living standard. I avoid using the term economic growth since, as I mentioned, it's not really agricultural data to prove this point. What's the difference? You see to allow the extensive decline in agricultural productivity caused by the extensive culture, you need to reach this point. This is a very low record. And this is a huge difference from my estimate with Professor Stuart Perkins' estimate about the early mean, which we have done 20 years ago. So what happened, what caused this huge decline? I followed Professor Stuart's approach. Basically, what you need to prove is what happened in Northwest China, North China, East China, and Central China, because they accounted for the very dominant share of Chinese acre. And here comes what I named the command economy. In the lower Yangtze Delta, even we follow the revisionist argument, especially the Professor Li Bozhong's argument, this is a very high agricultural productivity, even during the Yuan and the early Ming. However, we have the data to prove Zhu Yuanzhang basically destroyed the landlord here. And he controlled by this way, he confiscated their land holding, he controlled in Shanghai area more than 80% of the rural land holding. In the whole lower Yangtze Delta is close to 60%. How severe it was, it even surpassed what the Chairman Mao did in the early 1950s after the Communist Party took over. So you have this agricultural productivity sustained, right? But political economy works. That's command economy in one aspect. This is one special round. Then in Fujian, Guangdong, and the part of the Jiangxi, we do not have the sufficient data, although we know Li Jia system was carried on here. Here you have the long front line, right? That's the legacy from Mongol conquest, which Chinese government, Sino government could not control, but not because of Mongol imperialism, they inherited this large part of territory. Seizable, right? But poor land, no market town, no water transportation. Zhu Yuanzhang forced the people to move there to defend this land. People there was administered by the military system, even they were commoner farmed land. And in North China and Central China here, the upper and mid Yangtze River, you have depopulation. Basically, all these, prosperity, commerce, cities, they were gone because of Mongol conquest first. Then you have the civil war in the later 14th century. And all this part acreage in this area accounted for nearly 2/3 of China's total area under cultivation, right? That represents a very different, a miserable image in comparison to the Jiangnan, to Lower Yangtze. And Zhu Yuanzhang sent the soldiers stationed there. 80%, he has more than 1 million soldiers. 80% were assigned to farmland because He never wants to use money to wage wars. Right? He used a self-sufficient way. And they also forced millions of people to move there. According to the recent population historian research, they based on the genealogy, study of the name of the places, and the field research, all these things. They estimate for every 6 people in the early Ming, 1 was involuntary migrant. So this land farmed, in this farmed by these involuntary migrants accounted for more than 60% of Chinese total acreage. And what kind of capital or technical support they could get from the government or from themselves? You would find it's pretty low. Here is this population density. First, we mentioned the depopulation. Here you can compare this population density in the 1393 with Song, the peak year of the Song economy. The huge decline, right? 5% or just 10% in the extreme case. And you have the study the name of the villager and the genealogy that prove the large percentage from the migrant. And here is the data about the drafting animals, right? The number of oxen used in the military farm. We do not have the information from the civilian, forced migrant. But for the military, the soldier farm, we do have a report because the report level by level from general to Beijing. So if you divided the number of oxen by the acreage under the military farm, then you get this average farm size, per ox. And it's very huge in Henan and also in Hubei and Hunan, right? That makes the case, I only made a very small adjustment to Stuart Perkins' estimation, but the result is quite opposite because he ignored this part, the central China. He downplayed the significance of this region. And if you add them together, Nanzili and Hubei and Hunan, the Nanzili north of the Yangtze River, but close to the Nanjing, the Fengyang, Yangzhou, those regions. And we do. Now I have the scanty record of the farm yield reported either from the military farm or from the gazetteer or literati's report. It's not systematic, as I emphasize. Otherwise, I will 100% confident to claim my research, the conclusion. So you did see the huge decline in the later 13 in Shandong Peninsula and also in the northern Hebei. And we do have, these civilian migrants that report how each shared, you have 100 households just share, so few oxen number. So that's my conclusion. Finally, yes, we did. We did find without the rule of the market, the early Ming Emperor claimed to build up an egalitarian society. He eliminated the rich upper class, the landlord and the merchant. Will it do good to the commoner? The answer was no. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So again, we have Professor Yoshimi Kishiba to make comments on the previous page.
Yes, and I was deeply impressed by the Professor Liu's paper, which is indeed contribute a fresh contribution to the yes, macro macroscopic interpretation of the long-run trajectory of Chinese economic history since the Song. Let me limit myself in 3 points. The first is my appreciation of the Professor Liu's analysis of the hiatus, mysterious hiatus that took place during of the economic growth for about 2 centuries since late yuan to me. Here again, the pioneer of this issue was an Hopinti. He Hopinti refers to the breakdown of the slowing down of the pace of the economy in the early mean. But he explained it was just 70 years. It recovered by the resumption of the Grand Canal in 1415. So it's only 70 years. But Professor Liu's estimate is it lasts very long. Started with an early mean to the 1540. 1540s and it happened to be the year of the beginning of the silver inflow in large scale in the meantimes. So okay, yes. So I think that the main struggle with the yuan was many discouraging, left many discouraging effect for this depressive trend of the Chinese economy. For example, as Professor Liu suggested, the enforced migration and of people to the depopulated area and enforcement of military firms and mean policy of the subsistent economy and demonetization, forcible migration, and so on. These, and also the lowering of the military salary, and all these elements jointly affected badly to the growth of the Artisan economy, and particularly the depression affected the North China since Zero Qingjian and the yuan and in the meantimes. And this was at the time of the Hopinti, this was just a guess, but Professor Liu brought the problem. It's a more detailed analysis, particularly Professor Liu provides us with long-term perspectives, ups and downs of the trajectory of Chinese economy since sometimes. He also examines some economic growth, China's economic growth as an outcome of the interaction of the key economic elements of labor, land, and capital. What I particularly interested in is his approach in his use of the term standard of living. in assessing it as such, as each locality and at each time, he examines the conditions of both supply side and the demand side synthetically. For example, he argued that the increasing food demand from population growth in the zone was largely met or matched by the both increase in the acreage of the cultivated land and unprecedented improvements in farm yields per acre. So he sees an demographic growth as met by the other improvements in the elements of economy. So this, I think, is a very important postulation. In other part of his paper, he argues that notion of the agrarian revolution. I took that at Professor Deng's paper also. Is somehow an overstatement, and instead he looks into the improvements of livelihoods, or the improvement of standard of living by way of the progressive, intensive farming and commercialization of the economy. The third point is not a comment, but just a suggestion. As to the link of the production and consumption, there is a popular formula existing among the elements. For example, at least 5 elements are considered together. The one is the size of family, and also the second is the size of the acreage tilled, and the third is per acre productivity, and the fourth is an yearly consumption of grain, and grain and clothes and other daily necessities. And the fourth is an amount of rate of taxation, and amount and rate of taxation. And the seventh is an extent of the involvement in commerce and urbanization. And this kind of testimony started with the Warring Set period in a remarkable leak way. And then we find that relatively many testimonies in the Sun Yuan and Ming times. So it would be helpful for you to develop your study to collect such an useful data from among the Ming and Qing data, and Song Ming Qing data, and to assess relations more accurately. We have many, not so many, but very useful data about the connection of these 5 elements together. And otherwise, the data of the per acre yield, and just very rough, round data, and that's inclusive of the family and daily necessity and spending for the clothes and and others. So that is it is useful for to get together and to make a statistics by that, but we have some more reliable data to give the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have me. That's okay. I just need to get to the right slides and I will be all right. How do you get to the full? This one. There we go. Okay, I'm Ron Edwards from Tom Kong University, and this paper differs from the set of papers presented here today in that it's stylistic. There is a quantitative part, but I'm not going to go over it because of time. Most of my research has been trying to document qualitatively economic growth during the Song period. So that's not going to be covered here. This is more of a general framework to think about that. So granted, that needs to be documented. In fact, that has been the majority of my work over the past decade. But this is just a framework in the comparison with England to think about these types of things. So you're going to find evidence of Song China's growth and development completely lacking, but nonetheless, I hope this comparison will help us think about comparing China, and Song China and England in particular. I'm just going to use, I guess we use the arrows. There we go. For those of you who don't know, Song China simply means China during the Song dynasty, which is 960 to 1279, for which Marco Polo caught the end of. And here's an outline of the talk that I'm going to give. I'm going to make the case that there are two types of economic growth, modern and pre-modern economic growth. And the important point to gain from this is that pre-modern economic growth type is necessary for the modern economic growth type. That's the reason for going into this. And I'm going to argue that England, at least from the 1750 to 1850 period, and Song China both experienced this pre-modern economic growth. And in particular, both of these cases were preceded by what I'm going to call an embryonic stage, which is a set of which set pre-modern economic growth in motion. So I'm trying to ask the question of what the main causal factor that set these in motion. So the conclusion is going to be, if we're interested in finding out what caused this pre-modern economic growth, we should focus on what caused this embryonic stage. Okay, so this is the rough outline. Okay, so two types of economic growth. What I'm going to first do is define economic growth. It's a persistent increase in both per capita income and population. And next, I'm going to adopt Moltkier's notion of micro-invention-based economic growth, which I'm going to call pre-modern economic growth, and his macro-invention-based economic growth, which I'm going to call modern economic growth. Now, this includes science, but not only. There are other things as well. So you can think of as pre-modern economic growth, or as Joe Moltkier calls it, micro-invention-based economic growth. It's a type of learning by doing, tinkering with an existing original idea and turning it into a profitable enterprise. Macro inventions are largely unprecedented and have potentially dramatic effects in the economy. And this is, in his opinion, what set England off in the late 19th century. With this general framework, pre-modern economic growth is associated with a low growth rate of per capita income. Okay, and in England's case, this is essentially the work of Crafts and Harley over the past couple decades. They've lowered what we initially thought of as England's very high growth rate from the 1750 to 1850 period. And the first part of the paper quantitatively tries to make that case that the 1750 to 1850 period has a much lower growth rate than the 1850 to 1950 period. And I argue that this also roughly corresponds to the Song Dynasty's economic growth. Although we don't have any GDP statistics, it's suggestive of this. Now, modern economic growth is associated with a high growth rate of per capita income. So now start thinking about late 19th century England. Okay, so I hope I've made clear that two things. One is pre-modern economic growth, according to this, is something where it's a very slow per capita income growth. So think of Crafts and Harley in England's case. And I'm thinking the Song China's experience was something along these lines. Yet the market development and the transportation system development laid the framework for the subsequent modern economic growth in England's case. Okay, and so in this sense, it's necessary. So again, I argue pre-modern economic growth is necessary for modern economic growth. Here again, I point out England and Song China. England is in this first period, and Song China are cases of this pre-modern economic growth, very low per capita growth rates, and also population growth, but slow by modern economic growth standards. And England from 1850 to 1950 is a case of modern economic growth. Now, an important point here is that China didn't make the jump to modern economic growth during the Song Dynasty or shortly thereafter. That's an important question, one not addressed here. Okay? Why China did not make the jump is an important question that's not addressed here. And I'm going to focus on this pre-modern economic growth period and its causal factors. Okay, so in a very high-speed introduction, this is where I'm going to be focusing on this early period of England and comparing it to China. Okay, so this is the one of the main contributions of the paper. I'm going to quickly set the focus on this. I compare England, and in particular the 1750 to 1850 period, with Song China, and argue that these are both pre-modern economic growth cases. And I'm going to look for common preceding factors. Okay? The main finding is that both were preceded essentially by a series of events, which I'm going to call an embryonic stage. Now first, before I give a definition of what this creature is, let me briefly tell you what the timing of these things are. Okay, so for both cases in China and also in England. In England, I see the embryonic stage essentially, first let me start off and say that prior to this period, we see basically a Malthusian agrarian economy up to roughly around 1660. Okay, although you can't see it quite as well on the graph, that's actually 1660, not 1650. And from that period to roughly around the mid-18th century, I see this embryonic stage is taking place. And in China's case, it's roughly around 760. It's after the Anshe rebellion. okay, up to the unification of China during the Song period. Okay, so this is the period of the military warlords and the dramatic changes that were taking place as part of this Tang-Song transition. And emerging from this, I see this pre-modern, excuse me, I didn't change that. That should be economic growth, so slow rate with per capita income increases and population growth. Now, what is this? The embryonic stage consists of 4 phases. First is the commercial urbanization of the countryside. And I'll defer some detailed explanations until I get to the graphs. I think it'll be easier, so it will be slightly unsatisfying in the initial introduction, but I'll do it for brevity's case. So you really need to hit the countryside. And the one point here is urbanization has been going around since the Warring States period, if not earlier. It's when these zhen and these smaller towns start appearing in the countryside that it make markets available to the large portion of the population that you start to actually have effects on GDP per capita, the average person's income. Second, there's improvements in the internal transportation system, okay? So rivers are cleared, canals are built, roads are improved and extended, and so on and so forth. Third, regional specialization in varying degrees begins to occur, and and it involves increases in quantity and variety of consumer goods. And don't think of this in modern terms where there's, 50, 60, 70% of a region's goods are specialized and exported out of the region. This is a pre-modern area. So relative to previous periods, there's some regional specialization. Lastly, the development of markets and supporting organizations and improvements in money and credit. Okay, let me make a couple comments. These phases need not necessarily take place sequentially, okay? In particular, having said that, in practice, the first 3 phases, roughly speaking, are generally sequential. However, phase 4, that's the development of markets and credits, happens continuously with all 3 at the same time. In fact, they're intimately related. So here's a very stylized description of these 2 in some graphs that will hopefully put a little flesh on this and help convey these stylized ideas. Again, I just want to emphasize these are stylized. They're not based on primary sources of checking roads and canals and so on and so forth. But I've spoken with some experts like Nanny Kim on transportation, and at least in the Song Dynasty's case, it's a ballpark rough estimation, okay? But the point is here is to get the main idea across, okay? Eric Jones has argued similar things for England around this time in the earlier period here. Okay, so let's first take a look at Song China. So first of all, this Malthusian agrarian economy. Roads and cities are nothing new to China. They've been around for thousands of years. Okay, you've got the capital, regional hubs and main roads. When Qin unified the empire, they were paved roads and so on. There's no new technology here. What characterized this Malthusian agrarian economy was that these roads typically went to areas that were fertile in order to feed the court, or to dangerous military regions. Okay, so these were big, thick arteries, not only the ones that are drawn here, but to dangerous military areas that threaten the country, and also to feed the capital and provincial areas. So there were a collection of arteries that were basically administrative related for fiscal and military reasons. Now, what's different, after the Anlushan Rebellion, you start to see many zhen popping up. Zhen is the Chinese term for basically a small city or a small town. In particular, they were originally military garrisons. And they established themselves, and they began to appeal to commercial activities, in particular taxing them. Excise taxes were collected. And the second phase began where the transportation system locally began to develop, okay? And hubs began to emerge, specialized towns and Gen would appear, and they would specialize in marketing and collecting and transporting goods for certain destinations. And finally, we have a national market by around the 11th century. Now, this includes canals, roads, and rivers, and so forth. And again, this is just a stylized picture. Lastly, a degree of regional specialization. Iron is up in the northeast, tea is in Sichuan and on the south. Certain, my favorite, lychee nuts in Fujian began to become famous in certain areas in the country, and so on. And again, markets and supporting organizations continuously develop along with these three phases. So England, very quickly, Caesar set foot on this island, and there were roads and capitals back then. There's nothing new about that. So this Malthusian agrarian economy before 1660 was around. Roads were built again to dangerous military areas or to regions that would feed the royalty or the administrative centers. But then around the Restoration, you start to see some new towns starting to appear. Unincorporated towns begin to become established around here, especially up in the northeast and down in the southeast around some of the port cities. They started clearing rivers. And also, as the transportation system improved, it began with stagecoach roads and unifying, standardizing the stagecoaches, okay? So this is kind of an unsexy development of the transportation system before the railroads ever even appear. So this is around the 1670s and the 1680s, okay? And then the transportation system continues to develop, and eventually you get to the turnpike system, okay? This is kind of the culmination of the development of the transportation system that's better well known. A degree of regional specialization appears to an extent. Lastly, again, this fourth phase, the development of markets and supporting institutions, the Bank of England, credit, things like this start to appear. The monetarization of the economy is going on all at the same time, intimately related with these three phases. So in conclusion, to wrap it up rather quickly, so when addressing this main causal factor of what causes pre-modern growth, these two episodes show quite similar phases before them, in my view. The towns, the transportation system, some regional development, and so on. And I think maybe what we should be focusing on is what caused this early urbanization in the countryside, this commercial urbanization. Why all of a sudden are these towns and unincorporated towns popping up in England? Why are all these Zhen popping up throughout China in the late Tang and the Five Dynasties period? So the point of the paper is not to provide an answer, but try and focus the question a little bit tighter and say, well, what should be looking for and when? Well, in Song China, it's going to be right around the time of the Anzhi Rebellion, and in England, right around the Restoration. And so this is the conclusion. The conclusion leads to hopefully a more focused question for those that are interested in what caused this pre-modern growth, this low growth rate and population growth. Okay, thank you. Professor William Guanglin Liu will be my discussant.
To be honest, I'm not qualified to comment on this paper. Most of my work focus on the historical research, and I'm trained in the history department. But however, I'm also inspired by Ron's writing, and he's a great teacher with inspiration. Very persuaded his student in Tamarkan University to engage the debate on the historical issues, economic history research. All these things can be fully reflected in his writing of this paper. And I have no major disagreement with him on this theoretical issue he discussed here. It's basically an argument on prolonged pre-modern or early modern economic growth. So I would focus my comment on the structure, on the writing issue. It seems like a dialogue between the writing, reading the paper that makes me often confused. Then I realize it's actually a dialogue between Kuznets and Edwards. As we research in economic history, we all the descendants, we are students of Kuznets, right? But however, few researchers would so inspired by Kuznets that this framework, his theoretical, not only his theoretical framework, but all his ideas as Ron is. So basically, he in every part of his paper, it's a long research paper, covered so many fields, and it's not about Songqiana in particular. Actually, it's like a narrative about growth theory in Kuznets style, and its further critique, his revision on Kuznets' argument, words, vocabulary, even down to the level of the vocabulary. So I would suggest that Ron address the issue directly, rather than you claim you make empirical research between Songqiana and England, as you can't pay much attention to the Song case in particular. Say one suggestion, if you do, you should analyze the Song data in the different area and come across century by century. And one thing is you're picky to Kuznets to a certain degree. You almost on every, not only the framework, you made, I see this a very great, it's helpful, it's very helpful to read the paper that you address the reader all the latest scholarship about the failure of the first industrial revolution, right? The low economic growth and its strong connection to the economic development in pre-industrial world, rather than the connection to the, this different feature in comparison to the industrial revolution in the 18th, 19th century. We have this knowledge. We all owe it to the research by revisionist scholarship, like the Crafts research, all these things, and also the geometry you just mentioned. You generalize them very well, but I think it's a little bit too far. You try to criticize or every word Kuznets used there, like the modern. When you say, well, it's not the modern economic growth as Kuznets suggested, then you should modern economic growth basically means that this way, this is the direction, blah blah blah. I just checked, this not all of pages. I found all the keyword you give a double meaning. Then you set your reader in a trap, right? But still, I like the narrative. It's it can be. My suggestion is you can turn it into a book, a good textbook, that we can use in our economic history classroom to attract the student, to get more interested, they're engaged in the debate and get more interested, right, in the economic research issue, not only about China, not only about England, but about the pre-modern or early modern world, right, in general. I will stop here. Scholars, probably like Dr. Deng, can tell more specific, as you promised.
Okay, next we have Kojiro Taguchi from Osaka University.
Just wait a minute. I open my file. How's my presentation? Oh,
Yes,
The microphone.
all right, thanks.
Pull the microphone. Hold it down. Hold it.
So time is limited, so let's start it. Hello everyone, my name is Kojiro Taguchi. I come from Osaka University. So let's start from this topic. In 2010, it was reported that GDP of the PRC surpasses that of Japan. This news soon became a sensation among the Japan media and had a huge effect on the national psyche. It may seem funny that we made so much fuss over recent China's ascent in the world GDP ranking by simple arithmetic, when the population of the PRC approximately 10 times as large as that of Japan. The equivalence in the size of the national economy only means that output per capita of the former is 1/10 as much as that of Japan. What is the matter with it? The psychological strong impact Japanese people experienced when the PRC's GDP surpassed that of Japan in itself could be both a sign of Japanese excessively high evaluation for themselves ever since 1950s rapid growth era, or even before the 19th century, and the persistent low estimate for Chinese economic potential. In other words, our understanding is historically path-dependent, even when we see statistical phenomena like economic growth. Exactly from this viewpoint, I have a strong interest in conditions of economic growth and development, as well as connotation of and the relationship between the terms of growth and development. By reviewing the recent studies on the Chinese economic history, in this presentation, I dig into the manner in which we treat economic dynamics of China, and especially in which history is drawn. What needs to be questioned here does not merely lie in the concrete evidences seen as representing the dynamical processes of its economy, but also in the logical sphere in which we analyze, evaluate, and discuss this dynamism. So at first, I outline the background of which the development or the growth is discussed, and then touch upon the recent scholarship on the Chinese economic growth in the long run. Finally, I will explore how we can and how we cannot explain the dynamical processes of China's economy, especially in the context of the comparative history. So, for the avoidance of needless confusion, we have to make a minimal definition as to what exactly the terms of development and growth mean. In a broad sense, economic growth is the trend of sequential increase shown by and defined by numerical indices, whether it be Solovian and Smithian growth. In contrast, economic development connotes a dynamical and a transformative process in which a certain society undergoes a qualitative, revolutionary, and the transformative and staged change. This sort of qualitative and staged change is, notably in Marxist and Weberian context, often seen as an exclusive feature of history of the West. After the collapse of the Cold War regime, the premises of thinking about the economic development have been seriously undermined, along with the shift in the world politics and the increasing awareness of environmental finitude and ever-growing trend towards rethinking modernity. So thus, many of the theorists of Chinese history have been trying to switch the focal issue from Eurocentric models of economic development to more neutral categories, such as the market economy, which was flourishing ever during the imperial period, and to the economic growth as arithmetic sum of it. With this shift, economic historians have been increasingly centering upon the quantitative issues. This may be due to the remarkable advancement in the field of economics and quantitative history. At the same time, equally important is that the development of cliometrics has helped and partly at least benefited from ever-expanding narrative of global historiography. Recent scholarship has been increasingly focusing on the quantitative issues such as demographic change, level of living, and agricultural productivity in non-Western countries during the Premodern period. And that's trying to reveal non-Western countries during, to reveal non-West dynamisms of commercialization outside the West, sometimes as a background of the industrialization and capitalization in Northwestern Europe. The World Historical Statistics, compiled by the expert in national income accounts, the late Angus Madison, without doubt have encouraged the debate over the global economic history. In short, we are increasingly aware that we cannot underestimate the impact of extensive economic growth on the dynamisms in global sphere. So I plot the Madison's world GDP statistics on the line chart. It is clearly shown that the story of economic growth depends on the length of time scale. For example, before the early 19th century, contrary to the conventional image, the economy of the China was far greater in size than that of the West, except for the southern for around 1700. The gross output of China always doubled that of Western European countries. So this may engender three-tiered interpretations. At first, takeoffs in the West were short-lived phenomenon, and the recent expansion of the PRC's economy strongly indicates that it has been recovering its appropriate place in the global economy. On the other hand, the size of the Chinese economy merely represents its huge population, and in per capita terms, its average productivity had long stagnated. This position has been recently challenged by Kenneth Pomeranz, citing statistical figures in the Lower Yangtze. Third, these two positions are not necessarily mutually exclusive, given that the experience of the West may have been something unique. The trajectory of China's economic growth is even novel. And the normality has its region in the present PRC's economy, as being one put it. In the end, great divergence debate has been stalled by a dispute over the implication of uniqueness and normality, or unique normality, by Pamela Kyle-Cross's phrase, if ever. So what is my position as to this debate? A, the statistical basis for China's pre-modern economic growth is hardly robust, as economic historians may suppose. Especially the demographic data, Hukou, which only represented the proxy indicator of the governmental fiscal revenue. The problem is that when we aggregate the national account, whether in its total sum or in per capita terms, may inevitably engender amendable errors. Thus, Madison statistics only provides us with a good sense of scale in terms of Thomas Piketty. And this position is not to reject the value of the official statistics of Imperial China. Rather, official statistics in China is more useful when utilized as indices of medium term, or namely less than 200 years demographic change and its regional variance in limited area. Let me take an instance. In recent work, I have examined the population and arable acreage statistics of North China, seen in the mean official records. By using the world's hierarchical clustering method, found a specific regional or provincial pattern in population growth, increase of arable acreage and farm size in area around Beijing. And this pattern exactly coincides with, interestingly, approximately with the topographical settings in this area. In short, only in western Hebei, a relatively labor-intensive agricultural production was developed. If this model is in the capital area were to be varied, it may also well exemplify the value and utility of official statistics of mean population. That is to say, it suggests a possible credibility of official figure, especially in its relative value used as what represents a chronological change in regional variation, not figure itself. See, and when we acknowledge that the statistical data in national level is not so credible, we all the more have to evaluate the Kenneth Pomeranz story, not only his explanation for the Great Divergence, but that he shifted the unit of comparison from national level to region. That is the low Y&Z. Why is Deng able to compare the economic growth just between China and England, but inevitably enlarge the frame of comparison into a national level, China and England, or East and West? Actually, as plentiful sinologists have pointed out, the size, non-uniformity, and inequality of the present PRC are like no other. For instance, 10 years ago, total output of each provincial level administrative unit ranked with much of other Asian countries, and its disparity in terms of gross output and per capita product between regions was nearly tenfold. And moreover, historically, the trajectory of extensive economic growth varied even among the broadest geographical divisions of China, say North China and South China. Considering comparably higher level of per capita output in the southern provinces, disparity between the South and North should have been more remarkable. So at last, the problem is in which case and to what extent the national level analysis is appropriate and effective. Recent scholarship has been increasingly focusing on institutions of China. More often than not, whichever the conclusion, local experiences are extended to as much as national level. This is partly because governmental or formal institution is opposed with private and informal institution, convention or custom, both of which are equally seen as something provides individual incentive structures, or at worst, in the terminology of past sinologists, which suffocated the social development. Thus, institutional approach is nothing but another expression of Asiatic society, I think so. While the institutional approach is sophisticated analytical tool, and has been applied worldwide and in cross-disciplinary arguments, in terms with the Chinese economic history, it's a pity that comparative analysis has been exclusively centered upon issues of national level. Therefore, it is needed to construct a multi-dimensional model to explain how Chinese institutions arose, evolved, and coexisted, as well as how they are reinterpreted by contemporaries and by ourselves. At least, we have to distinguish between state institution and informal one. The relationship between them is not that one evolves into another, just as Douglas North put it, but rather that both evolve through reciprocal influences. That is to say, state institution, written law or regulation, etc., and normal informal one, social nexus, contractual custom, are different tiers of institutional structure with different games in accordance with the different rules. Thank you for listening.
Next we have Professor Kishimoto, who will be discussing this paper.
Thank you very much. Taguchi-san's paper deals with economic development of the early modern China, as its title shows, but its main argument is not about the economic development of the early modern China per se. For example, how and why Chinese economy developed in the long run, but about the concern and methodologies that have guided previous research on that issue. In this sense, Taguchi-san's paper urges us to make methodological reflection as well as to discuss China's economic history directly. As Taguchi's paper points out, the teleological development models based on the historical experience of Europe have lost its power during these several decades, and less Eurocentric models which focus on more neutral barometers concerning quantitative growth have come to be accepted by more and more economic historians in the world. Japanese economic historians have long been interested in population and land statistics compiled by Chinese dynasties and tried to critically analyze the characteristics of these materials. But they paid little attention to the Dwight Perkins type of research, which estimates the macroeconomic trends in Chinese history in the long run. It was perhaps partly because Japanese historians were not brave enough to make aggregating or averaging estimates like GDP or per capita GDP based on the scattered data available in historical materials. And it was also partly because they did not feel much reality in nationwide and long-term estimates, as not only the regional disparities, gap between the rich and poor, but also short-term economic fluctuations were so salient in pre-modern China. I'm not arguing that quantitative analysis are not so useful in search on pre-modern Chinese economy. For example, as some kind of quantitative figures such as grain prices were easily known by contemporary observers, we can construct a relatively reliable time series data of grain prices during the Qin using the materials based on contemporary people's direct observance. Contemporary people is subjective and ambiguous, but still very important in the studies of economic history. For example, let us look at the economic conditions in the late Ming. From the quantitative point of view, late Ming is generally considered as a period of economic growth when per mu output increased and the standard of living also improved, at least in the southeast regions. But as historians who have read late Ming local materials all know, late-ming intellectuals anonymously lamented the heavy tax burden and rural poverty and looked back to the happy and stable lives of 100 years before. This evidence suggests that the increase in the late-ming output may not be the consequence of the natural increase in the natural economic growth, but may be the result of the expansion of military expenditure and increasing tax burden paid in silver. The state finances, as an actor with compelling power, would assert a strong influence on economy, sometimes bringing people forcefully into market transactions and subsidiary industry. The importance of state finances and the growth of market economy can be observed not only in the late Ming, but also in the Song period, as Professor Kenneth suggests. The remarkable regional disparities remarkable regional disparities in Chinese economy, contemporary as well as historical, are not only caused by the differences in productivity, but also related to the nationwide socio-political structure. One of the Taguchi's main points is related to these disparities. He demonstrates that we should adopt not the whole of China, but a more limited area as a unit of analysis. His study on 15th to 16th centuries Hebei is persuasive, and I agree with him that nationwide averages are not so meaningful. At the same time, however, I still think that the whole of China is useful as a unit of analysis. Considering the importance of state finances and the common patterns in economic behavior shared through linguistic sameness, it would be still useful to analyze economic trends from the nationwide perspective. Taguchi also criticizes an essentialist approach included in some works of comparative institutional analysis, which emphasizes certain homogeneous and unchangeable characteristics in China as a whole. I agree with his remarks that this type of essentialist analysis somewhat resembles the Asiatic society theory in the 19th and 20th centuries. He also criticizes Abner Greif's notion in his paper that Chinese grants were a main hindrance to investments to scientific improvements. According to Taguchi-san, clan organizations showed only a limited distribution in China. I think this criticism is reasonable too. But as Taguchi-san himself notes, the concept of institution and the comparative institutional analysis is not necessarily so simple as to assume that institutions prevail homogeneously within one country. In 1949, Muramatsu Yuji, a Japanese economist, published a book entitled The Social System of Chinese Economy. In this book, he developed a method which somewhat resembled today's institutional analysis. He compared the dynamics of contemporary Chinese economy to games, which was unique to China. According to him, quantitative achievement of the economy is the score of the game, and state laws, system of government, social norms, shared mentalities, etc., are the rules of the game. And economic organization, for example, partnerships, putting out system, and so on, formed by people according to circumstances, are the tactics adopted by players in the process of the game. Players can choose their tactics in a flexible way according to circumstances, so their behaviors may differ with localities, with periods, and with situations. Nevertheless, they can be regarded as players of the same game organized with rather stable rules shared by themselves. If you could follow Murama's suggestion and consider clans as one of the tactics chosen by Chinese people, we might be able to understand both of nationwide commonness and local diversity in a certain consistent way. Anyway, Essential's method of comparative history has become outdated today. At the same time, though a purely quantitative approach without qualitative analysis may not be very attractive. If we could combine qualitative and quantitative approaches to construct flexible and falsifiable models in words of Karl Popper, they would bring fruitful results. Multifaceted comparisons, for example, comparisons not only with the West but also with Turkey, Japan, etc., will help us elaborate these models too. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Kenichi Tomobe from Osaka University to speak with us today.
Thank you very much. And first of all, my actual title is a little bit different from the former title. So we need to add infant before the mortality. So this change is very small but very important because I'm talking about not the macro relationship between population and economy in Tokyo, Japan, but I'm talking about touching on the microscopic relation between the babies and the mothers in Tokyo, Japan. My paper considers the effect of the economic development of Tokugawa, Japan, that is urbanization and rural industrializations as a phenomenon on both fertility and infant mortality, which are close related to each other through the health of pregnant peasant mothers who engaged in not only agriculture and household jobs, but by employment of rural household industries. But what we should think about here is how Tokugawa peasant negotiated with the drudgery or this utility of labor to keep the health of mothers and babies. So as you know, the historical demography of fertility in Tokyo, Japan, especially for comparative studies, should be based on the estimation of infant mortalities because most of Tokugawa population registers were lacking. Almost all the information of infant missed during 1 year after birth. So as the previous studies showed, the Tokugawa marital fertility was at a moderate levels compared to the same demographic stage of European countries, which was equivalent of 70 to 80% of European averages. The other characteristics of Tokugawa fertility were first, their reproductive behaviors are spacing rather than stopping. But it is not sure their motivation was intentional or spontaneous and natural. The second, the approximate determinants of fertility were frequency and length of breastfeeding, a degree of spontaneous stillbirth, and permanent sterility, not the quarter frequencies. Thus, the structural change of regional fertility patterns would be happened by the end of the 19th century, which showed from low fertility in East and high fertility in West of Tokugawa period to high East and low West of modern Japan. The infanticide of Tokugawa Japan was likely to happen as a limited and more backward areas they frequently received the damages of famine and drought during the war Tokugawa period, such as deep Tohoku region. To know why the fertility is so moderate, so primarily we have to, just a moment, yes. So to know why the fertility is so moderate, so primarily we have to think about the higher degree of labor intensity of peasant women, especially done at the agricultural field, adding to their basic householding activities since the age of their independence, so between late 16th century and early 17th centuries. But observing the trend of regional marital fertility until the late Tokugawa era, we have less chance to see the drastic change not only in Western Japan, but in Eastern Japan. Also, so many regional agricultural development had been happened in Japan during the same period. If it is so, so we have to pay attention to another factors which made marital fertility moderate regardless of region in Japan. So my paper tentatively pointed out to the effect from the infectious disease, especially from the sexually transmitted disease, STD, such as syphilis and gonorrhea, so which would have been spreading intensively all parts of Japan during the Tokugawa period. Traditionally, it is depending on the anecdotal evidences, but most recently, the paleodemography of Tokugawa Japan, and finding out the scientific evidence that almost half of the adult male population of Edo, presently Tokyo, were infected by any kind of syphilis. So my paper shows Yes, my paper shows higher morbidity of syphilis at the age 20 male population of modern Japan using the historical documents of syphilis investigated at the time of physical examination for conscription. About 3% to 4% morbidity of syphilis at the age 20 male population of the early 20th century Japan would easily expected to be rising to more than 40 to 50% at age 50 male population. So needless to say, so the effect was not limited to male population. The degree of spread of STD would be so high and extensive, driven by heavy migration as a process of urbanization. What the most important was, STD was not acute fatal disease, but chronic one, with which people live together by taking medicine and doing folk remedies passed down from ancient to the Tokugawa peoples. So besides STDs, we have to worry about the effect from smallpox, which was well known to be the most spread and longest survivals disease in the history of Japan, and especially gave heavy damage to infant and child populations. So these clinical diseases always did big damage to the society concerned. Going to the late Tokugawa period, the proto-industrialization appeared as the world Japan with constant support from each local Han domain government. This movement would be likely to bring the drastic change into ordinary rural scene, including the level of trend of fertilities since the late 19th century. If the rise of fertility was coincide with the improvement of standard living, at the same time we have to think about it from the viewpoint of infant mortality as index of baseline living standards as shown by the Human Development Index. That is, during the Tokugawa period, the fertility and infant mortality seem to be the two sides of the same coin, based on the argument of baseline standard living. The Meiji government promoted the basic development policies, Kandenbaku, which means the irrigation and the powerful cultivations, so resulting in the higher land productivities. So brought about small but steady change of fertility and infant mortality, which resulted in the structural change of regional fertility patterns of modern Japan, happened by 1920s. So it means, as for the fertility levels, Eastern Japan surpassed the Western Japan, which was reverse relation in Tokugawa period. My paper choice Aomori Prefecture's northern edge of mainland Japan, a typical area of economic backwardness of modern Japan, to know the effect of economic development on the improvement of infant mortality. Both the introduction of irrigation system and rural crop production into Aomori peasant villages brought about the decline of infant mortality through decreasing labor intensity of pregnant peasant women. So moreover, it probably contributed to the decline of stillbirth and miscarriage by the improvement of physical condition of peasant women, which lastly resulted in the rise of fertility. The similar mechanism of reducing infant mortality and rising fertility was likely to exist as a Tokugawa peasant household. So because Tokugawa peasant experienced the similar process of rural industrializations, where the putting out system was introduced and the peasant used their traditional level technology to get monetary income. So lastly, these peasant reaction towards urbanization and rural industrialization were based on their unique economic behaviors, named subjective equilibrium, which was originally speculated by Alexander Chayanov, and later developed by Chihiro Nakajima at Osaka and Kyoto University economist. As engaging with non-agricultural activities to get monetary income, peasants usually change their reallocation of their family labor toward substantive agriculture or market-oriented production due to thinking about the balance of their subjective utility of self-consumed products and monetary income, and their disutility of labors. As of observing the Japan's peasant behaviors, roughly speaking, both the decreasing of work intensity of female worker and increasing monetary income made a great contribution to the rise of fertility and the decline of infant mortality. Rather, the improvement of landed economy, such as irrigation, firstly introduced the decreasing of work intensity and labor disutility to female peasant workers, and then the monetary income effect assisted the tendency to reach the structural change of regional fertility and drastic decline of infant mortality in modern Japan. Thank you very much.
Professor Price Fishback.
Thank you.
Will discuss this paper.
So I've known Professor Tomobe for several years. He was my host when I first came to Japan, and so I'm a friendly discussant in this regard. One thing that I want to note is that, to a large extent, a lot of the paper is a survey paper, in the sense that there's a lot of work that went into this paper that is not described in depth in the paper itself. And actually, Kenichi doesn't talk too much about the techniques he's using in the paper, so I'm going to emphasize some of those a little bit more than he did. So he's been working on some of these issues for 25 years. I think a 1991 paper, is that the first one? Okay, so one of the things about this, and what he's known for in his research, has been to do a lot of regional and provincial and local collections of data for wages and interest rates and a variety of these kind of things. And so what's truly impressive about a lot of the work here is that he's actually using not just some national aggregate that's composed from some number you get out there. He's actually creating the national aggregate, or he's making comparisons based on kind of building up from a lower level. So he collects a lot of local information about births and infant deaths throughout Japan. Then he works to compare the fertility and infant mortality rates. And he's actually, I think the new change here is basically talking about the intensity of work and how that influences both fertility rates and infant mortality. And then he also ties this to venereal disease and sexually transmitted diseases. So here are the key results. He said this before. Some of the results from earlier is that Japan's fertility is lower than it is in Europe. In the 18th and 19th century, there are more abortions, there's more infertility, and there are longer periods between births. And longer periods between birth might be the dominant feature. Japan's fertility is higher than in England after 1900, although there's a big worry about Japan's fertility declining in Japan during this time frame. So then there's also comparisons between Eastern versus Western Japan. There's a shift in relative fertility, and the East is lower in the 18th and 19th century, and it flips, and they become higher after around 1925. I think that the real key here is the stuff on work intensity, and so there's a kind of a verbal description of a household model and household work intensity. The introduction of cottage industry, he argues, is actually lowering the intensity of work relative to what you do in agriculture. And so what that means is that the woman has more time to take care of the children, and thus is likely to lower infant mortality, and they're also able to have more children at the same time. One of the things he didn't talk about is the regression analysis. He shows that in a regression analysis across a number of regions, he shows that the results are consistent with the prediction, and that more labor intensity is tied to higher infant mortality rates, and more cottage industry is tied to lower infant mortality rates. Then the final thing is the sexually transmitted disease. I found this to be very interesting. He's talking about various legal changes in prostitution across these various locations, and that influences how many people are coming in. There's a lot of migration that's going across, and a lot of the venereal disease seems to be transmitted by people moving from different districts. So I have some suggestions for improvement. It'd be useful to have more definition of key variables. The M versus M is described, it's a coldness measure, but actually this is what he did in 1991. So I don't know if he really needs to mention M and M. He can just talk about spacing versus the size. It'd be really useful to know more about the size and the breadth of the panels. I wasn't quite clear as to how many observations there were in terms of the number of provinces or districts being compared. It would also be able to know if this is a panel or a cross-section. One of the things, if it is a panel, I'd like to know a little bit more about what happens if you include geographic fixed effects or year fixed effects in the panel. In my experience, a lot of times that kind of eliminates a lot of effects that show up just in a cross section or in a pooled panel. And then there were some times where there's one study that was Ayama district, I think, that's limited. It's limited to this one district over a period of time. It's actually an important piece of the paper, and it wasn't clear to me why it was just focused on that. Maybe it was lack of data. Maybe it'd be useful to know those kind of things. And I have one last request. I was a PhD student at the University of Washington, and so one of my professors was Kozo Yamamura. I had another professor there, Susan Hanley, and they actually wrote a book about fertility and stuff, and it's not cited in the paper. And so I think that for my own alma mater, I've got to ask you to cite them in the paper and stuff, because Susan Hanley and Karl Mosk wrote a whole series of papers in the 70s in pop studies about these issues. So thank you.
Next, we have Mio Tanaka as our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. We'd like to report the long-term changes of interest rate in credit and loan markets and the economic development during the Tokugawa period. Historical research on both European and Japanese proto-industrialization has pointed out that rural industrialization played an important role for the subsequent economic growth. Both the improvement of market quality and the growth of market infrastructure contributed much to the successful transition to modern capitalism. This presentation shows the improvement of rural credit market during the Tokugawa period from 1620s to 1860s using interest rate as economic index. The data of interest rate used in this presentation are calculated from the historical documents of loan contracts happened during the Tokugawa period from the early 17th century to the middle of the 19th century. This picture shows the sample of loan contract documents Choshu domain of Tokugawa period. These include many kinds of information on the loan and credit contracts, such as names of the borrowers, the lenders, and guarantors, the amount of money loaned, the interest rate, the mortgage, and some measures taken on default and so on. First, we analyze the quality improvement of the land market from the viewpoint of levels of interest rate calculated from the land lease market in the early modern Japan. Figure 1 shows the changes of interest rates of land market in early modern Japan from 1620s to 1860s. The interest rate from the middle of the 18th century clearly decreased as the demand of the funds for proto-industries and by employment by peasants increased. In such a situation, the issue of local note played an important role. In early modern Japan, the gold, silver, bronze currencies which the shogunate issued were basic currencies, but the lack of money supply is a serious problem. The local note was issued as territorial policy to solve this problem by each domain. In the 18th century, as the commercial production became active, the chance using the local note increased, and the local note was circulating stability. In this way, the local note spread over all the territory of the domains. The interest rate in the land lease market among the peasants decreased by fulfilling the peasants' demand for the funds. Next, we analyze the relationship between the improvement of the credit market and the proto-industrialization. Figure 2 depicts the relationship between the averages of interest rate from 1841 to 1868 and the proportion of proto-industrial production to the total production of 1874 by province named during the Tokugawa period, most of which correspond to present-day prefecture. There is a clear negative correlation between them at the total sample, which is statistically significant. It means that in the rural part of Tokugawa period, land lease market for small capital funding functioned well, corresponding to peasants' need. As Table 1 shows, by observing the provinces with a sample size of more than 10, these provinces, such as Musashi, Izumi, and Kawachi, had lower averages of interest rates, about 10%, and at higher proportion of proto-industrial production, more than 40%. Most of peasants in these areas made a living not only by producing agricultural products, but also by engaging in proto-industrial production and by employment since the 19th century. On the other hand, Mutsu and Dewa were famous for abundant rice crop, and their interest rate were about 20% in the middle of the 19th century. At the same time, the proportion of proto-industrial production in these areas was less than 30%. It means that these areas were suitable for rice cropping as compared to other regions, and the peasants in these areas earned more income by producing agricultural products rather than by engaging in the proto-industrial products by employment. The last part of the presentation provides the part of research result from the case study of one of the typical domains of Tokugawa proto-industrialization, Choshu domain, located at the west edge of mainland and famous as one of strong leaders of Meiji Restoration. Choshu domain is Suo province and Nagato province. Among many domains of Tokugawa period, the Choshu domain was famous for attaining the successful proto-industrialization during the late Tokugawa period, from the late 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. The Choshu peasants had been engaging in cotton textile weaving, vegetable wax producing, and paper making since the end of the 17th century. The profit coming from the production highly contributed to the financial basis of the Choshu domain. Figure 3 shows the changes of interest rate of the loan market in the areas of Choshu domain from 1701 to 1868. The annual changes of interest rate of the domain tended to be decreasing, as same as the case of the whole Japan. It seems that the reason for the interest rate decline came from especially the stable or increasing supply of local note. The Choshu domain, some additional supplies of local note happened 4 times during the Tokugawa period. In the 19th century, since the supply of local note by the domain increased, with the development of the real economy, the value of local note seemed to be stable. As a result, the interest rate also came to be stable. Next, we consider the relationship between the loan and the development of proto-industrial production using the example of peasant vegetable wax makers. The vegetable wax makers borrowed some money for transporting their products to northern part of Japan. This production was controlled by the domain monopoly system, where the vegetable wax makers borrowed some money for transporting their products to the northern part of Japan. This production was controlled by the domain monopoly system, where not only the materials of vegetable wax were exclusively collected, but also the production of vegetable wax was controlled by the domain. In addition, the domain encouraged the peasants to sell their vegetable wax to consumers of the other provinces. But since there was a time lag between their production and selling, the peasants who produced them used the land lease loan to obtain the funds for their production. As we can understand from the above example, the loan markets were effectively utilized for proto-industrial production by peasants. The volume of loan market enlarged as the late Tokugawa period approached. As having previous research on the loan and credit market of Tokugawa period, we can clearly show the 2 important results. First, the interest rate from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century had clearly decreased. The demand for money funds in the rural Japan had been expanded since the early Tokugawa period, and consequently, loan and credit market were improved, and then their interest rate also steadily decreased. Second, there is a significant negative correlation between the averages of interest rate from 1841 to 1868 and the proportion of proto-industrial production to the total production of 1874. Some areas where the interest rate were decreased at the middle of the 19th century were in the easy access to credit and loan markets, and moreover, their funds were utilized for investing to proto-industrial production, such as the case of the Choshu domain. We would like to conclude our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Next, we have Naomi Lamoro is discussing this paper.
Where's the, So the time is late. I will try to be very brief. You heard the conclusion. There are two main conclusions from this paper, which is that interest rates fell over time in the Tokugawa period, and that the regions undergoing proto-industrialization seem to have benefited particularly from that kind of fall in the interest rates. These conclusions to me seem very sensible, but I just want to provide some suggestions to try to help the authors make them stronger. So the authors present their results in the form of interest rates which are averaged over periods of about 20 years. And this kind of averaging is very sensible strategy, but they need to worry about sample selection in their data. Now, the overall trend in interest rates is based on a lot of different studies done by different scholars, and so they probably cannot do very much about the sample selection problems in that part of their paper. But the Choshu domain study is based on microdata, and as you saw from the document that Ms. Tanaka put up, it's very rich, and I think they can do more with that. So just very quickly, if you look at the basic findings from the Choshu domain, you can see that we have sample numbers, and then we have bands that give a range of the 75th to 25th percentile of the interest rates in their samples for each year. And so if you just look at those bars, you know that there's got to be a problem of sample selection because the size of them changes dramatically from year to year along with sample sizes. So it seems like one thing you would want to do from the very beginning is use some kind of multivariate analysis, like some kind of hedonic regression, where you would have the interest rate on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side some of those observables that we just heard about. And then you can put other things in, like these are nominal interest rates, but if there is available for this one area over time, rice prices and so on. And if you do this kind of study, then you can see how the observables affect the interest rate. And since you know how the observables change from year to year in your samples, you can use them to reweight the sample and solve some of the problems of sample selection bias. It also solves another problem for them as well, or potentially. One of the really interesting things about the early years is that they have very small samples, but that's because a lot of the loan contracts don't get into the samples because they don't record the interest rate. And so on the observables, you can look and see how those loan contracts may differ from the ones which are in the sample. Based on other parts of the world, I can think of stories why the interest rates that are in the contracts that specify them might be unusually high. I can also think of stories why they would be low, and so we need to think about those things. And let me just turn briefly to the analysis of interest rates and proto-industrialization. If they find a statistically significant relationship, negative, between the interest rate and the weight of proto-industrialization in the local economy. But if you look at the box that I've highlighted, you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity. And in particular, if you look at the low interest rates part of the graph to the left, you can see that there's a tremendous variation in the degree of proto-industrialization in the areas that have low interest rates. And so that suggests to me that these are really being driven by something else. There are lots of things that we could think about, like one would be location, right? And those may also be things that are driving proto-industrialization. And so, again, we could use some multivariate analysis to try to sort these things out and see whether proto-industrialization and interest rates are really a function of something else, or whether they're causally related. And finally, I'll just say that in this part of the analysis, there's also sample selection worries. If we just focus, I use different colors, but if you just focus on the ones where you have some reasonable sample sizes, you can see, if you look at the standard, I don't know if you can see this, but if you look at the standard deviations on the right, I honestly think that the statistical relationship would disappear. The statistical significance would disappear. And there's a lot of weird things going on in these samples. There's some where there's no variation, right, in the period, and there's some where there's a lot of variation. So clearly there are different draws here, and the authors need to think about how those draws are affecting the results. So I think this is really important work. The two findings are really believable, but some more multivariate analysis, some more attention to sample selection issues would really improve the results. So thank you.
Okay, we're out of time, overtime actually, and so I'd like to just make a concluding comment or two. First of all, this session, as well as some interviews with economic historians, will be appearing on ChineseEconomicHistory.com, so you can see them. And I would like to add one thing, since we're here in Tokyo. Earlier today, Kyoto. Thinking my body is in one place, I'm thinking another. Earlier today, I was interviewing Professor Yoshinobu Shiba, and we were talking about Song Chinese economic development. And one thing that happened is at the Kyoto School, that I got right. The Kyoto School was the early school in the 20th century which challenged the old version of China's stagnation and so on and so forth, that it was unchanging. And the Marxists, and that happened here in Japan, and the Marxists disagreed with that. There was a fight in the 60s and 70s, and an upshot of that is today, with the exception of the Marxists largely, who refuse to acknowledge the relationship between markets and social change. This group is small and increasingly smaller. In Japan, most people view Song China as having experienced economic growth, according to Professor Shiba. And that is a bit heretical in the United States to suggest that England was not the first country to experience economic growth. Yet, on the other side of the world, it's most Song experts will say that there was economic growth, meaning growth in incomes and population. Here in Japan, and against, again, that doesn't include the conservative Marxists. So for those of you in the West who do economic history or long-run economic growth, I would encourage you to take an open mind and take a look. Be critical, hold the critical standards, but there's a large group of people on this side of the world who view Song China as having experienced economic growth. There are also some, a good number who say the same thing about Tokugawa Japan. Eric Jones has written a book about this called Growth Recurring quite a while ago, and it kind of fell on flat ears on the West, but it's quite well accepted, or at least not controversial on this side of the world. So anyway, that's a plug for people interested in long-run economic growth to maybe get in a fight and debate on the other side of the world about growth. I know Jean de Vries has tried that with the Netherlands, but it's quite strongly established here. So there you have it. Thank you all for coming, and Again, you can see this session as well as several interviews on ChineseEconomicHistory.com. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Town is that its own economy supported a doubled population, and the Song was very commercialized, and the urbanization rate easily doubled the town level, and the Song was the beginning of the Chinese maritime history. The Chinese start to sail across East Asia and Southeast Asian waters. So why and how Song became so specialized, a special case in Chinese history? Why it didn't happen before and why it didn't continue later on? So to find out why, I will be very, very quick. There are two issues here and two major factors. One is environmental. The other one is geopolitical. Now, the environmental story is this. This is the right slide. If you divide the Song territory, which was roughly the Qin Empire when China was first united by the first emperor, you see China's territory actually shrunk from its town record size. If you divide the Song territory into these zones, then you realize, in fact, the northern part of Song, agricultural production declined. Reports were such that nobody wanted to farm in North China. Why? Simply because we had a little ice age, mainly affecting that part of China. Now, so people start to move south to grow food. Food prices going up simply because the shortage of food. And in the north, those who decide to stay, they become more commercialized and they start to mine iron ore and they start to produce iron steel, especially in northern part of the territory around Kaifeng, where the capital city was located. So the natural disaster actually persuaded Chinese not to farm, which is really quite extraordinary. Now in the south, they decide, because the little ice age, to support enough, to support people with enough food, they introduce a winter crop, which is the winter wheat along the Yangtze River region. So you have a double cropping in the south. Further south, and also in the west, farming was still very primitive, but because in the north people start to produce metals in these two regions, copper, lead, and tin, three major metals to produce bronze coins, began to take off. So you see the regional division of labor reshuffled in such a way it becomes something else. The farming economy becoming, in some ways, a mixed economy. Now, meanwhile, the Song faced enormous pressure from the north, perhaps for the same reason, because the Little Ice Age pushed the nomads southwards. And during this period, this is a Great War. The Great War was lost to the nomads. Also, the Silk Road is gone. So the Song Chinese start to pay tribute orderly to their
Sir, I am Shiba. I'm sorry for my inferior quality of the English. And the paper presented by Professor Deng is indeed a provocative argument on the causes of growth in some economy. It also challenges some of the conventional notions that is still prevailing. Professor can start with 1% population increase, population growth during that time through the late northern sun as an indication of an unprecedented evidence of the growth in the history of Chinese economy. Then he moves to his search for the causal explanation that brought about such growth and prosperity. First, he rejects the supply side explanation, especially the notion of the agrarian revolution, once raised by the Ho-Ping under the influence of the Kato Shigeshi. And among others, Professor Deng rejects the dissemination of improved rice seeds, champa rice. In the rice culture of the middle and south part of China, the Song, generally, I agree, I contend with his idea. But in my view, the champa rice is just one kind of the early ripening rices. And my some Japanese understanding of the merit of the champa rice is that it enables the farmers to avoid the damage by the heavy rainfall in June and September. So that it means a stabilization of rice culture in an area of the just reclaimed paddies in the central and south China. Yes. So but there's another Japanese notion that in terms of technology, the sun advancement is not so high. Just inherited the northern and traditional technologies in the north and in the south. The evidence is very rather scarce about the introduction of the oxen and new type of farm tools and the fertilizers and so on. So we should ask the causes of the population growth. If we take the population growth as a surrogate of the economic development, we should look into the another reasons. That is demand side, and he also put emphasis in his paper. Of course, and I just forgot to say that Professor Kent refers to the some kind of the improvement of agriculture in the north, but I cannot believe in that. For example, by a record of the Fu Qi in the middle of the yuan. There is an estimation that millet cultivation in the north, this is the case of the Shandong, was still largely stable or unstable. And people had to cultivate 100 more of land. But every alternative year, the harvest failure, crop failure, visited that farm. So although the estimated per acre yield was about 0.8 bushel of land. But the people have to calculate the average yield as just half of that, because then every another year the disasters comes. So far as I believe in this testimonies values, and I think in the middle of the yuan times, the agriculture in the north was not so high and unstable. This is a notion that Professor Lee also referring to. Say, okay. Okay. 5 minutes.
Take your time. Take your time.
Okay.
And the leisure you have.
Then move to the Professor Kent's second theme, that the Professor done another important suggestions. This is this is very impressive one. That is the pressure from northern nomads tribes and some states compromising diplomacy in response to it by giving ransom to such northern people, a fair amount of the silver and silk cloth and tea. And Professor Deng suggests that these are burdens of the northern government. Let them to push forward the industries and circulation of such items of regional trade, like tea and silk and so. This would be so, but I have some skepticism about the topic. We have some data in the maritime trade in the south that through Guangdong and Zhuangzhou, the evidence survived to tell us that abundant amount of silver was exported from these two ports. But in the hand of the Islamic merchant,
northern neighbors. This was the other. It should be the other way around. These guys should pay tribute to the Chinese, but not anymore. Why? Because they defeat the Chinese repeatedly. The Song army never actually won any war at all against all the nomads. So to actually support the demand from nomads, the whole economy geared towards selling. Why? Because the nomads didn't ask for women, they didn't ask for slaves, they didn't ask even for food. They want silk, they want silver, they want luxuries from Southeast Asia, such as, on the record, spices, such as turtle shells. So the Song Chinese had to actually go out to find those things, otherwise they will march in to finish the Song regime off. Indeed, they did. At the end of Northern Song, they take over the northern territory of the Song dynasty, and this will be the beginning of the Southern Song. So this is a demarcation, politically, line between the nomads and the Southern Song. So basically, the Song economy was in a turning point to become more commercialized because of the climate change and also geopolitical threat from the north. So after that, we see a change which can be highlighted as such. I have one chart to show what's going on, and that will be the end of my presentation. I have some, usual kind of a quantitative attempt to show the changes. Let's see where we are. I promise wrong. I'll be very short, very, very quick. Oh God.
This is the LSE speed reading.
Speed reading course, yes, indeed. We pay a lot of money for doing that. Oh God, well, I have a quite neat diagram. No, it's probably not in this with this version. Anyway, the result is this: the Chinese farming become regionalized and intensively done. Secondly, the Chinese economy start to become open towards shipping towards Southeast Asia. I just visited this morning the Cultural Museum of Kyoto, and they have a display of collections of Chinese coins and also displays of Chinese porcelain. The green porcelain started from Song Dynasty. Indeed, the Japanese start to import large quantities of green porcelain from the Song, from Song China, and also loads of coins hoarded by the upper classes of this town. And so here we are. Even in this place, we still find history showing the changes in China. Thank you so much.
Next, we have Professor Yoshimi Mishiba to discuss this paper. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending our session. This session is on intensive economic growth in pre-modern East Asia, 1000 to 1800. And I'd like to briefly introduce our panel. First off, we'll have Dr. Deng speaking on demystifying growth in the development of northern Song China, 960 to 1127. Professor Yoshiniba Shiba will be the discussant for that paper. Second will be William Guangling Liu, and his paper is entitled The Study of Evolution of China's Farming Patterns and Changes in Agricultural Productivity circa 1000 to 1500. And the eminent Professor Yoshiniba Shiba will also discuss that paper. Third will be myself, Ron Edwards, and my paper is entitled Economic Growth in Song China in England, and Professor William Guangling Liu will be the discussant for that paper. Next will be Kajiro Taguchi, and the title of his paper is Economic Development of the Early Modern China, Revisiting, and Professor Mio Kishimoto will be the discussant for that paper. Kenichi Tonobi will be the next presenter, Fertility, Mortality, and Economic Development in Tokugawa, Japan. And that will be Professor Price Fishback will be the discussant for that paper. Last but not least will be Miho Tanaka, and she's going to present a paper on long-term interest rate changes in the credit and loan markets and economic development during Tokugawa, Japan. Tokugawa period. And Naomi Lamore will be the presenter as the discussant for that paper. So without further ado, for time constraints, let's go ahead and please, Dr. Deng, please come up and present.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Thank you, everybody. And I know this is really a end of the day and also very hot. So I'm going to do it very quickly. The issue is Song China and its intensive growth. When I did my PhD, my supervisor told me, tell me about Song. And I said, I know nothing about Song. And he was completely disappointed. I said, you're Chinese, how come you don't know anything about Song? Now, 25 years later, I know something about Song. So here we are. Now, the difference between Song and pre-Song